The city of London was alive with the sounds of tourists and locals moving through the busy streets. Near Buckingham Palace, one of the most famous landmarks in the world, people gathered to watch the royal guards in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats. They stood motionless like statues, guarding the gates with discipline that had impressed visitors for centuries. Among the crowd was a man who looked out of place. He wore a dark suit and moved with a seriousness that made people step aside without realizing it. He was not a tourist. He was not there to take pictures. He was an FBI agent on a mission, sent from America with a file that contained information so sensitive it could not be sent through emails or trusted to any normal courier. The agent's name was Mark Turner. He had worked in the FBI for more than 20 years, handling cases that involved terrorism, espionage, and international crime. His life had been built on trust in his instincts, and his instincts had saved him many times. But those same instincts also made him suspicious, always expecting danger to appear around the corner. On this day, as he approached the gates of Buckingham Palace, those instincts were at their highest. He believed there were people following him, people who wanted the file in his bag. He tightened his grip on the leather case he carried and looked over his shoulder more than once. The royal guard stationed at the gate noticed him right away. The guard was young but highly trained. He had been standing still for hours as the tradition demanded, yet he was trained to notice the smallest unusual movement. Mark's shifting eyes, his nervous steps, and the way he clutched his bag set off alarms in the guard's mind. The guard took a step forward, the polished boots hitting the ground with force, and lowered his rifle slightly. He did not say a word, but his presence demanded attention. Mark froze for a moment. He knew the rules of the royal guards, how they protected the palace with discipline and strength. Yet in his mind, the situation was different. He thought the young soldier might be part of a plan to stop him from delivering his file. His pulse raced. His breathing became heavy. He imagined the possibility that his enemies had already reached London, and now even the palace was not safe. The crowd nearby began to notice the scene. Tourists who were taking photos stopped, sensing the tension in the air. A hush fell over the group as the tall guard stared at Mark, his face unchanging, his rifle angled slightly forward. Mark felt trapped. His training told him to remain calm, but his fear told him to act. In that heated moment, his hand moved toward his coat, and before anyone could stop him, he pulled out his gun. The metallic glint of the weapon caught the sunlight, and a gasp spread through the crowd. Mothers pulled their children closer, people stumbled back, and cameras dropped from shaking hands. The royal guard did not flinch. He had faced many situations where people tried to test his strength or discipline, but never had anyone drawn a firearm at such close range. Still, he stood tall, his eyes locked on the man before him. His hands tightened around his rifle, but he did not raise it yet. Behind him, the other guards noticed the movement and adjusted their stance, ready to act if the situation grew worse. Mark's heart was pounding in his chest like a drum. He could hear his own breath, heavy and uneven. He knew he had made a dangerous choice, but in his mind it felt like survival. The silence was overwhelming. The tourists froze, unsure if they were about to witness something unthinkable on the steps of history. The royal guard, silent and composed, looked straight ahead as if carved from stone. Mark's hand trembled on his gun, but he tried to keep it steady. Seconds felt like hours. The palace gates stood tall and unyielding, the symbol of centuries of stability. Yet at that moment, they were the backdrop of a scene no one expected. Some people whispered in fear. Others quietly pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The sound of shutters clicking and video starting filled the air. Mark noticed it, and it made him feel even more cornered. Every move he made was being watched, not just by the guard in front of him, but by the entire world through the eyes of strangers. The young guard's expression did not change, but his mind was racing. Training drilled into him the importance of remaining calm no matter the threat. He knew reinforcements would be alerted the moment a weapon was drawn at the palace gates. His only duty now was to hold his ground and prevent the situation from exploding before backup arrived. His eyes did not waver, his posture did not break, and that silent strength made the moment even more intense. Mark whispered to himself, words no one else could hear. He told himself he was doing the right thing, that he was preventing an ambush, that he was protecting the mission. But deep down, a part of him wondered if he had just created a disaster. He had been in many dangerous places, but never had he faced a situation like this, standing at the gates of a royal palace, weapon drawn with dozens of eyes locked on him. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. The air was thick with tension. Mark's grip on his gun grew tighter, sweat rolling down his temples. The guard remained unmoving, a symbol of discipline. The crowd dared not move closer, afraid that even the smallest noise might spark chaos. And somewhere deep inside the palace, alarms were already sending signals to the armed units who would arrive in moments, ready to surround the embassy and bring the situation under control. Mark's world had shrunk to the space between him and the guard. He no longer saw the tourists, the palace, or the city around him. All he saw was the silent soldier who stood in his way. His mind was a storm of fear, duty, and confusion. But one thing was certain. He had crossed a line that could not easily be undone. This was just the beginning of a story that would soon draw in armed palace units, embassy officials, and high-ranking leaders, all because of a single choice made at the wrong moment. The silence around the palace gates grew heavier with every second. Mark Turner's hand shook slightly as he kept his gun pointed forward. Though his training told him never to let fear control him, his thoughts raced in circles. He wondered if his mission had already been compromised, if someone had planted enemies among the guards, or if the file in his leather case had attracted attention far greater than he realized. His instincts screamed that danger was close, yet another voice inside him whispered that maybe he had misunderstood the moment. But it was too late now. The weapon was out, and once drawn, it changed everything. The royal guard stood motionless, his face showing no fear, no anger, only the calm strength that years of training had built into him. The tall black bearskin hat made him appear even larger, almost towering over Mark, though he did not move an inch. His discipline was legendary. He had been trained never to flinch, never to break his composure even when confronted by danger. Still, his body was ready, muscles tense, eyes sharp, rifle steady. He did not need to say a word to show his authority. Other guards stationed nearby began to notice the commotion. They could see the glint of the gun and the tense stance of their fellow guard. Without a single command, they shifted slightly, closing in formation, their rifles angled just enough to prepare for action. The sound of boots scraping against the cobblestone sent a shiver through the air. The crowd stepped back even farther, pressing against the barriers, some whispering prayers, others recording videos with trembling hands. Mark's chest heaved as he tried to breathe. The weight of dozens of eyes on him made his mind heavier. He had been in firefights before, in secret operations where no one else was around to see. But this was different. He was surrounded by civilians, by history, by symbols of authority that could not be ignored. The cameras pointed at him made him feel exposed. Every second that passed was a risk of becoming the headline of an international scandal. For the Royal Guard, the test of discipline had never been greater. He could feel his heart beating faster, but his face betrayed nothing. He knew reinforcements would arrive soon. He also knew that any sudden movement could trigger the man with the gun. His duty was not just to the palace, but also to the safety of the people standing nearby. A single wrong step could put innocent lives at risk. So he did what he had been trained to do. He stood his ground, letting the calmness of silence weigh heavier than the fear of action. Mark's eyes darted around. He noticed the tourists, the flashing cameras, the murmurs. Every whisper made him feel cornered, as though someone in the crowd was waiting to strike. His grip on the gun tightened. He thought about his orders, about the file in his possession. The information inside was explosive. Names, locations, secrets that powerful enemies would kill to have. If he failed now, the mission would collapse and maybe Liv's back home would be lost. He convinced himself that he was right, that pulling the gun had been necessary to survive. Yet deep down, doubt crept in. He wondered if the guard was truly a threat, or if he had just created an enemy where there wasn't one. The stillness shattered when a tourist dropped their phone on the cobblestone. The sharp crack echoed through the square. Mark flinched, his finger twitching dangerously near the trigger. Gasps rose from the crowd. The guard's eyes narrowed, his grip on his rifle tightening, but he still did not move. His discipline saved the moment from spiraling out of control. Mark cursed under his breath. His nerves were fraying. He glanced toward the palace, imagining reinforcements rushing down hallways, suiting up, grabbing weapons, and preparing to flood the gates. He could almost hear it in his mind. The pounding of boots, the orders being shouted, the sound of armored vehicles coming closer. He knew he had little time before the situation escalated far beyond his control. Inside the palace grounds, Silent alarms had already been triggered. Security personnel watching through cameras had seen the weapon drawn. A code red had been sent to the palace unit stationed nearby, units trained for rapid response to threats. They were already on their way, their boots hitting the ground in unison, their rifles ready, their minds focused. What had begun as a misunderstanding at the gate was about to turn into a full military response. Meanwhile, the tourists' fear spread like fire. Some parents pulled their children away, rushing them to safety. Others crouched low, hiding behind barriers. Yet some, unable to resist the pull of history, continued recording, their phones capturing every detail of the unfolding drama. For them, it felt unreal, like a scene from a movie. But for Mark, it was all too real. His hands trembled slightly, sweat dripping down his temple. He adjusted his stance, trying to show strength, but his body betrayed his fear. The royal guard finally made a small movement. He shifted one step closer, boots echoing sharply. The crowd gasped again. Mark's gun followed the movement, his eyes wide. The guard's expression never changed, but his action spoke loudly. He was not afraid. His silent defiance pushed Mark further into the corner of his own doubt. He realized the guard would not back down, would not surrender, no matter how long the gun was pointed at him. Mark's thoughts raced faster. He considered lowering his weapon, but fear stopped him. If he appeared weak, what if his real enemies attacked then? If he gave up, would his mission be lost? He had lived his whole career by trusting his instincts, but now those same instincts had brought him into the center of a disaster. He looked into the guard's eyes and saw something that unsettled him: calm. The calmness of a man who was in control even though he should not have been. The crowd whispered louder now. What's happening? Is he a terrorist? Why does he have a gun? The voices fed into Mark's panic. He tried to block them out, but every word dug into his mind. His heart pounded, his palms sweated, his vision narrowed. The world shrank again until only the guard and his rifle filled his sight. Minutes dragged by, though in reality it was less than 3. The palace square had become a stage, every actor frozen in their role. The FBI agent with a gun, the royal guard with unbroken calm, the crowd holding its breath, and unseen forces moving in the background. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and everyone knew it. Far away, sirens began to wail, though faintly. Mark's ears caught it first. Reinforcements were close. His time was running out, and he had no plan for what would happen next. His mind filled with regret and fear, but he kept the gun raised as though lowering it would shatter him completely. He told himself he had no choice, but deep down, he knew he had created a moment that no training could undo. What had started as suspicion was now on the edge of becoming an international incident. And as the sound of approaching boots and vehicles grew nearer, both Mark and the guard braced for the moment when silence would finally break. The sound came first, a deep thundering that seemed to rise from the cobblestones themselves. Heavy boots striking in perfect rhythm, vehicles grinding their wheels against the stone road, radios crackling with sharp voices. The peaceful image of Buckingham Palace, so often a place of photographs and admiration, was now shifting into a fortress responding to a threat. Mark Turner heard it before anyone else did. His FBI-trained ears caught the march of soldiers and the faint hum of engines. He realized the reinforcements were arriving. His stomach dropped because he knew what that meant. The situation was about to explode into something he could not control. The tourists noticed next. Their whispers grew louder, mixing with gasps and cries. Many scrambled to get away, rushing toward the outer streets. Others, unable to resist, stayed frozen, their phones pointed like eyes that would never blink. The palace square was no longer a gathering for sightseeing. It was now the stage for a standoff that no one had imagined when they left their homes that morning. Mark's grip on his gun tightened. His arm felt heavier by the second. He had been in long standoffs before, but never one with so many witnesses. Never one where history itself stood watching. His eyes darted between the royal guard and the growing shadows of approaching soldiers. He felt like a cornered animal, his instincts screaming to act, yet his mind clouded with doubt. Should he lower the weapon? Should he try to explain? Every option seemed to make him weaker, yet holding the gun made him look more dangerous. The royal guard still did not move. He stood calm, his tall hat making him appear larger than life, his hands steady on the rifle, his face unreadable. Inside, his muscles were tense, his heartbeat steady but strong. He could hear the reinforcements too, and he knew they would arrive in seconds. His duty was to remain composed, to buy time, to prevent the man before him from making a fatal mistake. That silent patience was his greatest weapon, and it unsettled Mark more than any bullet could. Then, the first wave of palace units arrived. Dressed in tactical gear, their weapons ready, they moved with precision. They did not rush blindly. They surrounded the area in coordinated steps, closing off every possible escape route. Their black vehicles blocked the roads. Their boots echoed like thunder, and their eyes locked on the scene unfolding at the gate. In moments, the palace square became a sealed cage. The crowd gasped as the soldiers fanned out, rifles raised, voices commanding in firm tones. Some tourists dropped to the ground, hiding behind stone barriers. Others screamed and fled, scattering down the nearby streets. Those who stayed pressed themselves flat against walls, phones trembling in their hands, desperate to record history even while fear pressed against their throats. Mark turned slowly, his gun still raised as he watched the armed units spread out around him. His heart raced. He could see their rifles aimed directly at his chest. He knew that if he made even the smallest wrong movement, he would not leave the square alive. Sweat ran down his forehead, dripping into his eyes. He blinked it away, trying to think clearly. But clarity was slipping further from him with every second. "Drop the weapon," one of the commanders shouted. The voice was strong, commanding, echoing through the square. Mark flinched. He had been on the other side of those words many times, the one giving orders to suspects. Now he was the one being ordered. He felt the weight of the role reversal crush him. The royal guard remained still, almost as though he was not part of the chaos, yet his calm presence anchored the entire moment. He had become the silent line between one man's fear and the response of an entire military unit. Mark thought of his mission. The file in his bag still mattered. He could not allow it to fall into the wrong hands. His mind replayed the warnings he had been given, the coded messages that made him believe enemies were close. For him, this was not just a mistake, it was survival. But now the scene before him had become bigger than his mission. He was standing in the middle of an international standoff, and every second stretched into eternity. The soldiers tightened their circle. Some crouched low, their weapons locked on him. Others positioned themselves at higher ground, their scopes fixed. The radios crackled with updates, voices overlapping with urgency. Mark's breath came quicker, louder, echoing in his own ears. He could feel his arm trembling now, though he tried to hide it. The tourists who remained dared not move. Some were weeping quietly, others whispering to each other. The entire square seemed to hold its breath, as though the stones themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Mark's mind began to race with possibilities. Could he try to run? Impossible, the circle was too tight. Could he fight his way out? Ridiculous, he was outnumbered and outgunned. Could he shout the truth about his mission? Would anyone believe him? Or would his words be drowned out by the sight of the gun still in his hand? Every thought crashed against him, leaving him more desperate. Drop it now. The commander's voice rang out again, firmer this time. Mark's finger twitched on the trigger. The soldiers stiffened, ready to respond at the smallest spark. The royal guard's eyes narrowed, his composure unshaken. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to explain, but his voice felt trapped. He wanted to trust that they would listen, but fear told him they would not. His entire life, his entire career had been built on quick decisions under pressure. Now one wrong decision could end everything. Not just his mission, but his life. The sound of a helicopter cut through the sky above, its blades chopping the air. Dust swirled in the square as the aircraft hovered, a sign that even higher authorities were now watching. Mark's heart sank deeper. The entire world seemed to have its eyes on him. Every second grew heavier. His gun weighed like iron in his hand, his arm aching. The soldiers held steady, their sights locked. The crowd trembled in silence, and through it all the royal guard stood still, the symbol of calm discipline waiting for the storm to break. Mark whispered to himself again. Words of fear, of hope, of regret. He was alone, surrounded by men ready to end his life, with only his doubts to keep him company. He wondered if this was how his story would end. Misunderstood, trapped, remembered as the man who pointed a gun at a royal guard. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice urged him to wait, to hold on just a little longer. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way out. And so the standoff continued, the tension stretching thin, as armed palace units surrounded the embassy walls and prepared for whatever would come next. The square outside Buckingham Palace had turned into a frozen battlefield. Mark Turner stood at the center, his gun still raised, sweat dripping down his temples, his breath uneven. The royal guard in front of him had not moved, his discipline unshaken, while the circle of armed palace units around them grew tighter and tighter. Rifles were locked, eyes were sharp, and orders echoed across radios. The tension was so thick that even the air felt heavy. The commander of the palace units lifted a hand and repeated his order. "Drop the weapon now!" His voice was steady, not shouting in panic, but commanding with authority. Every soldier waited for Mark's next move, ready to react in a heartbeat. The crowd behind the barricades had gone silent again, their phones still raised, recording what might become history. Mothers hugged their children, tourists prayed, and whispers of fear floated in the air. Mark's mind was in chaos. He thought about his years of service, all the times he had been the one demanding suspects to surrender. Now he was on the other side of that order. It felt unreal, almost like a cruel twist of fate. He wanted to explain, to tell them that he wasn't a criminal, that he was an FBI agent carrying information that could save lives. But he could see the cold steel of rifles aimed directly at him, and he knew words might not save him. To them, he was just a man with a gun pointed at one of their guards. Inside the palace, officials were already moving quickly. Intelligence officers and embassy representatives rushed through secure halls, scrambling to explain what was happening. Calls were made to the U.S. Embassy, and high-ranking officials were pulled into emergency meetings. It was clear to them this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding anymore. It had the potential to become an international crisis, one that could spark diplomatic tensions if not handled with care. Mark's eyes darted toward the gates. He saw a group of men in suits rushing forward, carrying documents. His heart leapt with a flicker of hope. He knew them. They were embassy officials. Perhaps they could explain everything before it was too late. But the soldiers were tense, their fingers on triggers, and the smallest mistake could still turn the scene into tragedy. The embassy officials shouted to the commander, holding up clearance papers. Their voices were urgent, trying to prove Mark's identity and explain the mission. But the soldiers didn't lower their weapons yet. They couldn't take the risk. A gun was still in Mark's hand, and until it was lowered, he was considered a threat. Mark felt the weight of the moment press against him. He had spent his entire career fighting to protect lives, not endanger them. Yet now he was the reason an entire square was filled with fear. He could see the royal guard's calm eyes staring into his own. It was strange, those eyes didn't look angry, they didn't look afraid. They looked patient, almost as if the guard trusted that this moment would end without violence. That silent confidence cut through Mark's panic more than any shouted order could. For a second, Mark considered lowering the gun. His arm ached, his mind screamed for relief. But then he thought about the coded message he had received before leaving Washington. The warning that someone would try to stop him before he delivered the file. What if this was it? What if the whole scene had been arranged to trap him? He convinced himself that surrender might mean failure, and failure was not an option. The embassy officials pleaded with him now, their voices carrying through the tense air. "Agent Turner, put it down. We have clearance. Let us handle this." Their words hit him like a hammer. They knew his name. They knew who he was. That meant the truth was out. If he could just trust them, maybe this nightmare could end. But Mark hesitated. His finger twitched near the trigger, not out of intent but out of fear. The soldiers saw it and adjusted their aim. The commander raised his voice again, sharp and final. "Drop it or we will fire." The square went still. The only sound was the faint chop of the helicopter above, circling like a hawk watching prey. Mark's chest heaved. His thoughts raced between surrender and defiance. Every second he delayed made things worse, but lowering the gun felt like admitting defeat. He imagined the headlines, the judgment, the disgrace of being the FBI agent who caused an international scandal. His pride battled with his reason. His fear battled with his duty. Then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the chaos, calm yet commanding. It came from one of the palace unit commanders, but softer than the shouts before. "Agent Turner, we know who you are. This can end peacefully. Don't let one mistake define your life." The words hit him harder than the threats. They weren't treating him as a criminal anymore. They were treating him as a man who had made a mistake. For the first time, Mark's eyes softened. His grip loosened slightly. The royal guard remained still, waiting. The embassy officials continued holding out the documents, urging him with their eyes. Mark looked around. Dozens of rifles aimed at him, hundreds of eyes watching, cameras recording. His choices were few. Slowly, painfully, he began to lower the gun. His arm trembled from the weight of both the weapon and the decision. The soldiers stiffened, ready for anything, but they did not fire. Inch by inch, the weapon came down until finally it pointed at the ground. The commander gave a sharp order, and in an instant, soldiers moved in. They surrounded Mark, their steps quick and precise. One of them grabbed the weapon and kicked it away. Another secured his hands, though not harshly, more like a formality. The tension began to shift. The crowd exhaled for the first time in minutes. The square, which had felt like a battlefield, was beginning to breathe again. Mark closed his eyes as they took the gun from him. He felt a rush of shame, of regret, but also of relief. The embassy officials stepped forward, waving the clearance papers, explaining loudly to the palace commanders. The truth was coming to light now, that Mark Turner was not an attacker but an FBI agent carrying sensitive files. It had all been a misunderstanding fueled by fear and instinct, yet the damage was already done. The world had seen him with a gun raised at a royal guard. The soldiers had been seconds away from firing. The tourists had captured every second on their phones. No matter how much the governments tried to contain the story, the moment would live on in memory, in whispers, and perhaps in headlines. Mark stood quietly as the palace units secured the area. His mind replayed every second of the standoff, the choices he had made, the doubt he had felt. He wondered if he had just ended his career, if his years of service would be forgotten because of one decision made in panic. But for now he was alive, and the file was still safe. That was the only comfort he could hold on to. The royal guard remained at his post, his face unchanging, his discipline unbroken. He had stood firm through the entire ordeal, a symbol of calm strength in the middle of chaos. Mark looked at him one last time, silently acknowledging the guard's courage. Without that calmness, the day might have ended in tragedy, and as the embassy officials continued their explanations, and the palace commanders weighed their next steps, one thing was certain. This was no longer just about a gun at the gates. It had become a lesson in discipline, trust, and the thin line between instinct and disaster. The standoff had ended, but the tension lingered in the air like a heavy fog. The sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, and the last echoes of boots striking against the cobblestones quieted as the armed palace units shifted their focus. The immediate danger was over. Mark Turner no longer held his gun. The royal guard still stood tall and composed, and the embassy officials clutched the clearance documents that had prevented tragedy. But though the moment had passed, the weight of what had happened hung over everyone who had witnessed it. Mark stood between two soldiers, his hands loosely secured, his head slightly lowered. His heart still pounded, though slower now, as if finally catching up to what his body had endured. For the first time, he felt the true gravity of his mistake. He was not just a man with a gun anymore. He was an FBI agent whose actions had nearly caused an international crisis at one of the most symbolic landmarks in the world. He had faced hardened criminals, dangerous terrorists, and moments where his life had hung by a thread. But never before had he felt such deep shame. The royal guard remained in position, as calm and still as he had been throughout the ordeal. His face showed no triumph, no anger, only the same steady discipline that had carried him through those tense minutes. Tourists whispered among themselves, pointing toward the guard with awe. Some called him a hero. Others said nothing, still processing the fact that they had stood so close to something that could have ended in disaster. Children clung to their parents and adults clutched their phones tightly, knowing they had captured something that might never be seen again. The embassy officials hurried forward, their voices firm and urgent as they explained Mark's identity to the palace commander. They held out the clearance papers showing seals and signatures that proved his authority. The commander studied them carefully, then glanced at Mark. His expression softened slightly, though the rifles around him did not lower until he gave the order. When the soldiers finally stepped back, Mark let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. His hands were released, though slowly, as though the soldiers still didn't fully trust him. The embassy officials placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him away from the center of the square. Every step he took felt heavier than the last. The cameras followed him. The whispers followed him. And though no one shouted, the weight of silent judgment pressed down harder than any word could. Inside the palace, Mark was taken to a secure chamber where officials from both nations gathered. The room was filled with tension, though now it was a different kind of tension, not the fear of violence but the strain of diplomacy. British commanders, embassy representatives, and intelligence officers sat around a table, their voices calm but serious. They spoke of what had happened, what could have happened, and what must be done to ensure it never happened again. Mark sat quietly as the officials debated. His gun had been taken, his authority questioned, and his reputation tarnished in front of hundreds. Yet he knew he was lucky. Lucky that the Royal Guard had not reacted too quickly. Lucky that the palace units had shown restraint. Lucky that the embassy had arrived in time with clearance papers. Without those small chances lining up, the story would have ended very differently. After hours of discussion, a resolution was reached. The British authorities agreed not to press charges, recognizing that Mark's actions had come from misunderstanding and fear, not malice. But they also made it clear that the incident would remain in official records. The Americans promised to review their communication protocols to ensure no agent would ever act under such confusion again. Both sides agreed to keep the details away from the press as much as possible, though they knew controlling the spread of tourist videos would be impossible. When Mark was finally allowed to leave the chamber, the night air felt colder than before. The palace square had mostly cleared, though a few curious onlookers remained, whispering about what they had seen. The Royal Guard was still at his post, standing tall and silent as though nothing had happened. Mark paused for a moment, watching him. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to thank him for his discipline. But the guard did not move, did not respond, and Mark realized words would not change anything. The silence itself was answer enough. As he walked toward the embassy car that waited for him, Mark thought about the file he still carried. It had been the reason for his fear, the reason he had convinced himself that danger was everywhere. It still needed to be delivered, still needed to reach the hands of those who could use it to protect lives. But now its importance felt heavier, not just because of the secrets inside, but because of the cost of his mistake. He had almost destroyed everything over it. Back in his temporary quarters that night, Mark sat alone at a small desk. He placed the file in front of him, staring at it in silence. His reflection in the window looked older, more tired than he remembered. He thought of the guard's calm eyes, the commander's steady voice, the embassy officials rushing to save him from himself. He thought of the people in the square, the fear on their faces, the trust they had in the men who protected the palace. And he thought about his own instincts, how the instincts that once saved him had nearly led him to ruin. He wrote a report, as duty required. In it, he admitted his mistake. He explained his fear, the coded message, the pressure of carrying information that could not fall into the wrong hands. But he also wrote about what he had learned, that sometimes the greatest strength was not in drawing a weapon, but in trusting others to stand strong without it. In the days that followed, the incident was quietly buried in official reports. The governments worked hard to keep the story away from headlines, though the tourists' videos still spread online in whispers and private circles. To most of the world, it was just another rumor, another dramatic tale without proof. But for those who had been there, the memory was carved into their minds. The Royal Guard received quiet praise from his superiors for his composure. He did not boast, did not speak of it. He simply returned to his duty the next day, standing at the gates as though nothing had happened. His silence was part of the tradition, and his calmness remained his greatest strength. For Mark, the experience never left him. He continued his service, but with a heavier heart. He carried with him the lesson that fear can blind even the most experienced, and that discipline can prevent disaster. He often thought of the guard, the soldier who never spoke a word but who had held back a storm with silence alone. Years later, when he told the story to a trusted few, he did not describe it as a moment of shame but as a lesson that saved him. He would always remember the young guard's eyes, steady and calm, and the moment when silence proved stronger than fear. The world would never know how close they had come to tragedy that day outside Buckingham Palace. For most, it was just another ordinary day in London. But for Mark Turner, for the Royal Guard, and for those who had seen it with their own eyes, it was a reminder of how thin the line between peace and chaos can be, and how one man's discipline can protect more than just the gates of a palace.